a webinar and a follow-on from a webinar we delivered back in July, and at that webinar we talked about very much about the legislation changes, about how the compliance check process works in detail, and some hints and tips about the new additional information form that was coming in, and also about the importance of the technical narrative in explanation of what the R&D claim is that you're doing. So on this one, we're going to focus on some new information. So there was an RDCF, which is R&D Communication Forum, held with HMRC at in July, and so we can talk about the information that they presented. And importantly, there was a CIOT letter. Now, CIOT is the
Chartered Institute.
I've forgotten what the C was. Chartered Institute of Taxation. It's one of the accountancy membership bodies, and they sent in a letter in July to HMRC, really questioning some quite important details about how HMRC were operating in respect of R&D tax credit claims. So I'll go through that letter and the response that came out at the end of August from HMRC in quite some detail. I'm happy to take questions. As I say, if you post the questions in the chat, and then Sam will kind of keep an eye on those. And then later on, we are really pleased to see that we've got Jesminara Rahman joining us. She is from a company called Tax Resolute Limited, and she is an ADR expert, having been a design lead at HMRC when she worked at HMRC on the ADR process, and now works with companies on tax investigations across the board, and assisting companies to get a resolution with HMRC. So Sam will be having a chat with Jesmin towards the end. Okay, so let's move on. So just a quick summary. Yes, we're talking about R&D tax credits. It's all about an advance in the field of science and technology and resolving technical uncertainties. And as I said last time, it's about understanding what the baseline is, and therefore you can define what the advance is. I'm going to fairly quickly go through. There are two schemes currently. That might change. There's an SME scheme for under 500 employees in the group, or over 500 employees, or where you have subsidised projects where you can claim under the RDEC scheme. Now, this is again background as to where HMRC are coming from in respect of all the compliance checks and over-checking that they're doing. You know, there's been some quite heavy publicity in the media around how tax and fraud is prevalent in particularly the SME scheme, which is where HMRC's focus is. So in order to address that, they are introducing some changes, and those changes are from the 1st of April. They have been changing the SME rates. So they're lowering the SME rate from the 1st of April, but they're increasing the RDEC rate. Now that actually balances up the two schemes pretty much so that they're on an equal footing. Still some variances, but they're more aligned. They've introduced mathematics, data and cloud computing costs as eligible costs in the schemes. And from 8th of August, the additional information form is now compulsory. So that is a separate portal from any other systems government gateway that HMRC operates. Now, interestingly, there was an email that came out from HMRC early September to say that even though they've kind of publicised this portal, 50% of all R&D claims that were put through HMRC in August still hadn't used the additional information form. So those 50% of those claims have been straight away rejected from HMRC, because it is important that that additional information form, which is the technical narrative, is submitted before the accounts with the R&D claim is put through. So the message from HMRC is obviously not getting through to companies. Obviously, the corporation tax rate changed as well, which influences how much you get back on the two schemes as well. Now, going forward from that, there is further future changes. So there is a change to introduce intensive industries schemes. So where a company is over 40% of expenditure, they can get an enhanced cashback payment of 27p a pound. Not as good as it used to be. It used to be 33p in the pound, but it's better than what they'd proposed, which was about 21p in the pound. That's will be retrospectively actioned, so it will be from the 1st of April 2023, but the legislation hasn't been put through. So currently nobody can actually utilise that until the legislation's passed, and then you can retrospectively go back and change it.
And that'll be through Ian, that'll be through an amended CT 600, 600L.
Yes. So currently,
etc.
Yeah. So currently you can only claim a certain value on it, but if you do meet that 40% of expenditure, you can then resubmit the our CT 600, and I'm presuming you're going to have to put through an additional information form before you do that to then get back your additional enhanced expenditure from HMRC. They are looking at SME and RDEC schemes to be combined. There's a bit more information that came out from the RDCF later, so I'll talk about that. And then overseas subcontractor costs, ineligible from the 1st of April, unless it's for social or environmental reasons or some capacity reasons. So there are certain reasons where you can use an overseas subcontractor, but one of those that you can't justify is it's cheaper to go abroad. You cannot use that anymore. Okay, so.
And I don't think you can use the argument that I've used this subcontractor for years, they know all about our business, we want to keep using them.
No,
that's not a good enough reason.
There's no technical reason unless you cannot find an expert in the UK. If an expert exists and it's still not as good as the one abroad, you'd have to use the one in the UK or not a claim for the one abroad.
And I imagine that some people may say, well, we'll just set up a shell UK company and invoice that, but still take the work overseas. That doesn't ring true either, does it?
No, it has to be, the final work has to be done in the UK for it to be eligible. So you can't subcontract it through somebody else and they subcontract it abroad. It doesn't work. So moving on to the RDCF. R&D Communication Forum. Now, this has been operated by HMRC since about 2014, and it's a twice yearly meeting between agents, and that can be accountancy bodies, professional bodies, and HMRC, and it's an opportunity for HMRC to talk about what's happening with the R&D tax credits. You know, how's the operations going, what policy changes are coming up, and an opportunity for those agents and professional bodies to ask questions. So it's a good opportunity to kind of engage with HMRC. Pre-COVID, it used to be in person. Obviously, post-COVID, it's now a webinar. That's probably better in some respects because that actually allows more people onto the webinar, because it was restricted in numbers previously. And the last webinar happened in July, 23rd of July, and not massive amounts of detail. You know, it lasts about 3 hours. You're allowed to submit questions to HMRC. We submitted about 16 questions, particularly around some of the process and some of the issues we're seeing. Unfortunately, none of those 16 questions got answered by HMRC, so a bit disappointing. Now, they went through looking at policy update. So obviously they've had this intensive scheme introduced, which should be from the 1st of April, but the government are still considering changes at the moment. There's no indication that those changes will actually go through or what those changes could be, but the cost of implementing the intensive scheme is about 500 million and will benefit about 20,000 companies. So they've kind of quantified how much it would cost to implement this scheme, and they see, HMRC does see that as a benefit to support the early stage micro businesses, small businesses that are really investing in R&D before they go to market. They talked about the merged schemes. So the proposal is that from potentially the 1st of April 2024, the SME scheme and the RDEC scheme will be merged into a single scheme based on an RDEC type scheme. They're not going to call it an RDEC because otherwise it gets very confusing. Which RDEC are you claiming? But there are options around that. So they want to make it simpler to use. Obviously, you've got two different schemes and administrations, and they're used in very different ways. They're looking at the subcontractor rules because obviously under the current RDEC you can't have subcontractors, but they want to be able to introduce subcontractors as part of the SME company claims. And there's an expected announcement as to whether the government's actually going to go ahead with the single claim system at the next fiscal event. Yeah. That's about as much as we know.
Do we know, Ian, whether the combined scheme is likely to be an above the line credit?
Yes, so it's in above the line RDEC types credit.
Okay, so for what that means for companies is that they'll be able to see the benefit of the R&D claim within their normal accounts, within their profit and loss.
Yeah,
because it will be like a line of income.
Yeah.
So that can be quite useful to if you're going out for investment or you're reporting within a group structure, that the UK is a great place to do R&D because you can get this very obvious benefit instead of having it tucked inside the tax comp where nobody looks at.
Yeah, yeah. And I think they will go for the RDEC type scheme if they go for a combined, because on the creatives reliefs, which is theatre, high-end television, video games tax relief, they've gone for an RDEC type scheme with those. They are very much moving to an RDEC scheme for all tax reliefs. Yeah. So they talked about some of the 2023, 22, 23 numbers, and there's a slight change here. So total number of claims increased from the previous year only by 1%. Now, that's been the smallest increase in claims by companies for quite a number of years. Now, whether that's been an impact of the compliance checks or whether it's actually starting to plateau out with the number of companies that think that they can claim, don't know. They didn't really discuss why that increase is smaller. Normally, we've been seeing increases of between 15 and 25% every year. They did talk about their processing. So they get peaks in December and March with year ends for companies, and their target is to process 90% within 40 days of receipt of the claim. And they achieved 92% in December, January, and 91% in March and April. So they seem to have got their capacity issues sorted out, particularly around those peak periods. So that means no delays in companies receiving their claim, as long as they don't get a compliance check. Targets, despite the fact that they're hitting their target at 90%, they're actually going to lower it down to 85%. Don't quite know why. But they're going to make it easier for themselves to actually achieve that target. They've got an ambition of dedicated R&D claim performance section with an agent services dashboard. No idea what that's going to look like. No idea what information is going to be there. But apparently it's going to be more information about the processing of an R&D claim. So you can kind of, at the moment, it kind of goes into a dark bucket and it comes out when your money comes out, so it's very kind of opaque. Obviously, we talked about non-compliance quite heavily. They've massively increased their estimate of what fraud and error is on R&D claims, and most of that seems to be within the SME sector. The SME claims with about their estimate of 1 billion, which is up from about 343 million, I think it was. So it's a massive increase. But that was based on just 500 claims where they kind of intensively looked at those claims, and out of those 500, they rejected 125 through fraud and error. Which they think has saved about 250 million in 2023. Now, interestingly, they've talked about there's been a big emphasis on where the fraud is within the SME scheme, but actually their estimate of fraud is less than 5% of that figure. So actually errors within the scheme claims is a bigger issue than necessarily fraud.
So just out of interest, if they're saying that 125 claims rejected is 250 saved, that's an average claim value of 2 million.
Well, what they're saying is by applying this across the rest of the compliance work that they're doing,
Right.
then by doing that, they're saving 250 million, not just on those 500, across those 500, but on the many thousands of compliance checks that they've actually put through. Which
but as we know, there's statistics and lies, don't we? So what is fraud for the purpose of what is really fraud, and what is an error, which can be a simple mistake. So it'd be interesting to actually see the real numbers behind that and how they've categorized things.
Yeah, they did publicise some details before the RDCF, but there's not an awful lot of additional information that came out at the RDCF. But apparently there will be a further update and a policy update in winter of 2023 about how they're attacking compliance checks, which will be interesting to see. Right, so moving on to now at this RDCF, obviously they'd previously had this CIOT letter. Now, the CIOT letter was about 5 or 6 pages long, quite detailed, mentioning quite a lot of legislation and some of the manuals that HMRC uses, and really pushing back on the approach that HMRC is taking in respects of R&D tax credits and the aggressive nature that they're taking. So I've pulled out the kind of pertinent details of where they were kind of pushing back on. So HMRC have gone down this, following the 500, they then went down a policy of volume compliance approach. So they're looking at large numbers of R&D claims that are being put through. And in order to do that, they have had to build capability at HMRC. And as a result of that volume compliance approach, CIOT and many agents out there are seeing poor behaviours by HMRC. So we're seeing technical law being quoted wrongly. We're seeing poor communication in documentation. An example of being simple grammatical errors, wrong company names. So they're just copy and pasting letters and leaving the wrong company in there, and wrong projects being mentioned. So there's a lot of rushing by HMRC, and some of the issues that they're mentioning and questions, we really don't believe that they're correct in their meaning of around the law.
Yeah. So I had an interesting one the other day. I was chatting to a company, and their letter questioning their R&D tax claim was from the fraud department. We believe you have committed fraud. I mean, just how terrifying is that for a 3-man band SME who's making a legitimate claim? It's just really scary tactics. It's not a balanced approach at all. And HMRC would argue that, well, we've had to use the fraud department because we're so busy in the R&D, we've just handed some work onto them. But the communication and the language is really quite terrifying for a lot of SME, well, a lot of companies.
No, and that's not unusual, unfortunately. There's been, CIOT kind of mentioned a lack of engagement and discussion. An example of that is, many of the caseworkers at HMRC that are working on R&D claims, they're lay people, they're not technical by nature, but they'll come out with statements like, it is my opinion that is routine work to be completed by a competent person. So they're contradicting what the competent person's saying is what was difficult about that project, and making sweeping statements that is actually very difficult to back up, and that's where the technical narrative comes in. So on the process side of things, they're closing inquiries, but with no proper closure notices. Now, that's actually quite important, because without a proper closure notice, a company actually has no right to appeal, which means you can't move on to further stages, which we'll go on to later, one of which is the ADR process, which we'll talk about a bit later on. CIOT questioned the careless behaviour. HMRC have got a very much sort of sweeping statement that if you didn't speak to HMRC and ask a question, that's careless. Well, we disagree. in dealing with competent professionals and agents, that is not careless. By taking advice, that is not being careless. But there seems to be a sweeping statement that they're applying careless behaviour on which results in penalties, as well as asking for a repayment of the R&D claim. And that's all resulting in breakdown of goodwill, trust with HMRC, taxpayers, and probably discouraging legitimate claims. So it is hard work with HMRC at the moment, and they seem to be fairly entrenched at the moment with what they're doing. So these slides will be circulated, but there's a little link down at the bottom right. That actually takes you to the CEOT letter, so you can read that in detail, just to sort of see what the CEOT raised with HMRC. So going on to the actual reply, and I've got 3 slides on this, so there's quite a lot of detail. So it was quite enlightening on the reply, because there's some admissions from HMRC that have not come out before, and some additional information that's not come out before. So one of the major parts is HMRC's response, and this is direct out of the letter or response. HMRC's response not met its professional standards and charter commitments. So they recognise they are not operating to their own processes and their own standards. So that's quite a big admittance. So they are looking at process review to be able to support and train the caseworkers that are on the HMRC teams for the R&D tax credits. No idea what that timescale is going to look like, and what that process review is looking at. Now, interesting bit of information. Apparently, out of all the R&D claims that are submitted, 90% of all claims are supported by an agent. Now, that's something that we didn't know before. So, that's quite a heavy level of agent involvement with all R&D claims. And HMRC wants to see a collaborative working with representative bodies to improve compliance. They see it as well, let's get the agent community in control. And, I think it's fairly recognised that not all of the agents out there are as responsible as TBAT and many others that are good agents.
I think just on that, Ian, I was anecdotally talking to a client on, I think it was last Friday, came into the office, and he was saying that previously, pardon me, he was always inundated with letters, "Can we do your R&D tax credit claim?" And I think since the changes that HMRC have brought in, so more compliance checks, and you need to submit stuff by project on the portal, he says, "I've not had a call since August." So I think some of the steps that HMRC have put in place will be great for the industry, and it will mean that the more professional companies will come through as being, this is the way to go with the claim, and not using a backstreet boiler house kind of activity where they're just putting in outrageous claims in the hope that they go through. And I think, to me, that was really quite encouraging, that it is having a change on who's in the market for doing R&D tax claims for people, and I think that's a positive result.
Yes, and I think it will, and we've seen it, because of this reliance on the technical nature of the claim. We are seeing more accountants pulling away from doing R&D claims, and so we've seen more inquiries on that side of things as well. So HMRC still believes that 50% of all claims rising to 75% of all claims under 10k are non-compliant in some way. And that's where a lot of the errors are creeping in, not necessarily the fraud, but the errors are creeping in. And I've put this red cross in red because it's quite a big admittance that because of their volume approach that HMRC are taking, they recognise that it will have impact on compliant claimants. So they recognise that some of the claims that should be going through are not, because either companies are reluctant to put the claim in the first place, or they get a compliance check and they then pull the R&D claim from HMRC. So it's actually discouraging genuine claimants from making R&D claims. As part of their volume compliance check process, They've engaged one of the HMRC teams, campaigns and projects teams, targeting large volume claims in certain trade sectors. So, for example, if they're, I don't know, painting and decorating, if they're seeing a high volume of claims coming from painting and decorating, would they normally see painting and decorating as an R&D claim?
Well,
no. Doesn't necessarily mean you can't. Depends on what the companies are doing. So just because they're in that trade sector doesn't mean they can't make a claim, but it is probably unlikely. So they talked about some of the numbers. They expanded the team. So in 2021 they had 93 full-time equivalent specialists. They've increased that to 191 amongst the 500 compliance officers that work on the R&D claims. I think obviously there's a training issue there.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen, Ian, is that during an inquiry, the caseworker can change 2 or 3 or 4 times, and I do wonder why that is. Is that because it's churn and people just don't like being in this role because it's really uncomfortable for them as well, or I don't know, but that's really poor, that continuity. So there's no chance to build up a rapport or familiarity with the technology that the company's developing, and it's just like passing a hot potato down the line.
Well, it actually goes beyond that. So with all compliance check, they use a generic email for every compliance check with every company. Now, what we've actually discovered is that email will go into that and it gets dealt with in sequence, and it's whichever caseworker picks that project up in sequence when it gets to the top of the pile. So it's not just that 2 or 3 will be.
If I can intercept, there's 2 approaches by HMRC. So one is what I call a conveyor approach, where you have a team and whatever post comes in via email, and it's dealt with whatever caseworker is in, whoever is in on that day. And that's why you're not getting continuity, because different members are in on different days and so on. And so it gets circulated. You don't have that continuity because it is literally like a conveyor belt approach. And there's not a dedicated, allocated caseworker to each case. So you don't have like a central point of contact. It's the whole team that is responsible for the case. And that's why you don't have continuity. Then you've got the other approach where you have, for larger claims maybe, or different kind of risks that has been identified, you may have a point of contact, one point of contact, and you see that because they will say, can you send it to this person directly? So you've got the caseworker's name. But the other impact that we can see on the caseworkers is there's been a lot of office closures over UK. And so with the office closures, either the officers leave because, there's no office attached, or they're moved. So that's the other impact you've seen. And on those cases, you'll see different people being allocated. Even though it's meant to be a more individual approach, you have one point of contact. But because of all the changes going on in HMRC and all the offices actually closing down, or offices getting changing offices, that's why you see several like officers on that specific case.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Jasmine.
Okay.
That's really good. Okay, so moving on, raising agent standards. So I think it's recognised, as I mentioned earlier, that agents need to be better. Some are better than others, and it's about HMRC would like to see that how to raise those agent standards. At the moment, there's no standard in place, or there's no requisite to say, well, actually, how do you become an R&D agent? Anybody can become an R&D agent if you've got no experience in R&D whatsoever. So it would be interesting to sort of see how that develops. As I said, the additional information form will support better provision information. That was HMRC's statement. I agree with that. It standardises the way that technical reports are presented to HMRC and the level of detail within that technical report. And I've always been quite strong on the report, and I think having a standard way of presenting it will help HMRC. So they talked about some of the reasons that claims are being ineligible. So it's not a field of science or technology, so they'll reject it because it's in arts and humanity. But that doesn't mean that an arts department might not have done an engineering project that allowed them to deliver something in the way of arts. So it doesn't mean you can't claim, it just has to be something that has a science and technology derivative project. Upgrading internal systems, using existing technology applied to a new industry, and a bespoke solution that doesn't involve science and technology. Again, it's all in the detail. Is there an advance that's being created? From the financial side, common reasons R&D is overclaimed or wrong scheme. Ineligible costs on using marketing, things like marketing, which should never be utilised in an R&D claim. Consumables that went on to be sold. There's a slight difference there. If the consumable is scrapped, you can use it in the claim. If you sell it to a client, even at cost, you can't use it in the claim.
Can you so if you scrap something, it costs you £10,000 to build a test rig for R&D purposes, which you then scrap and you sell it for £10. Are they saying that you can't claim any of that, or can you claim all but £10?
On scrapped material, you can claim the 10,000. You can actually ignore how much you got back for it on scrap. But if you sell it to a customer as a usable item, then you can't utilize it in the claim. Subcontractor or subsidized costs. Now obviously that affects whether you claim under the SME or the RDEC scheme currently. Now obviously that also refers to what was called the Quinn case, which is where HMRC argued where the boundaries of project costs are and whether it should be RDEC or SME. And it seems that HMRC are still questioning the validity of that case, even though it went through a first tier tribunal. Penalties applied. They used words like prudent, reasonable, evidence of behaviour, reasonable care, and they are looking at examples that CEOP provided, and I want to see where other examples, so where they can make sure that they're being consistent in their approach going forward. So again, there's a recognition there that they're not being consistent. So they apparently are reviewing the CURD manual. The CURD manual is the Corporate Intangibles Research and Development Manual. So that's an HMRC internal manual. It's publicised on the web, so we can refer to it. And they are also working on new drafts for guidelines for compliance. Now, there is a link there, which it comes through on PDF, then you can click that link. We'll give more visibility of planned compliance activity, working with agents and representative bodies to address error and fraud in certain sectors and share compliance communications. So again, they recognise that some of the examples provided by CEOP fell short of their standards. So again, it's a recognition that they're not doing what they should be doing. They talked about the random inquiry process, where 500 claims. One company withdrew because as soon as the inquiry was open, 22 withdrew because they eventually agreed the claim was not valid, and 11 withdrew because it just wasn't worth the time and costs of fighting the compliance check. But apparently they were quite low value claims, but no details overall on those. So common reason R&D is claimed. Have I copied that in? No, so I've already covered that one. I left that one in by mistake. And then HMRC's compliance professional standards, which was introduced in July 2022. Apparently they run regular surveys to assess awareness and application of the standards. And I've never seen a survey or never heard of one of our clients getting one of those surveys. But where they fall short, additional training will be provided. Now, in all of this, no timescales have been discussed by HMRC, so I don't know when or how these are going to be implemented. So that was the letter from HMRC. It was a really good insight, and the first time HMRC really admitted that things are not going right as they should be going. and it is impacting companies and genuine claimants. So next, I'd like to move on to ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution, and we are really pleased that we've got Jesminara Rahman, who is ex-HMRC. We'll go into that a little bit in a minute. But just as a resume of where does ADR fit in the whole compliance check process. So you might get a letter, you might get, as Sam said, an accusation of fraud, which opens up the compliance check. You'll get a series of rounds of questions, and it could be 1, 2, 3, 4 rounds of questions, and you reply to that, and you've got 30 days to reply to each of those letters. HMRC seem to be taking longer and longer and longer to then read those replies and come back to you. So that just lengthens the whole process. They may offer a call to caseworkers. We've had a couple, but they seem to be pulling away from that. And again, that was one of the criticisms that COT sort of saying, you know, there's actually a right to engage with HMRC caseworkers, but that right's not being allowed. They will then offer a review by an HMRC officer or the SOLS team. Now, the SOLS team is Solicitor's Office and Legal Services. So sounds a bit scary, but not sure what the benefit is. Whenever we've gone through that process, they just seem to back up each other. At that point, you get a decision letter to say, yes, your claim has been rejected. And that's the important letter to say, at that point, you can then make an appeal. And from that appeal, you can go to tribunal and then opt to go to ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution, which is what we're going to focus in on in having a chat with Jesmin.
Yeah. So that piece about HMRC refusing to engage is quite interesting, because HMRC, I understand it, has got an obligation to teach to work with every single taxpayer on the same basis.
Yeah.
So if it's a corporation tax investigation, you might then be able to talk to a caseworker. That's your right, but they're actually refusing to do that on R&D tax.
Yeah.
And you think, are you therefore treating every taxpayer with the same criteria? And the answer would appear to be no.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, to introduce Jesmin. Jesmin is ex-HMRC. She was a tax advisor at HMRC for a number of years, and then latterly, in her time at HMRC, she was actually the design lead in implementing ADR, Alternative Dispute Resolution. So I can categorically say Jesmin is a world expert in ADR.
World expert, they're powerful words in, but you're absolutely right.
She has her own business, Tax Resolute Limited, and through that she then supports tax investigation with her clients and other businesses, and works as an ADR mediator with those clients. And so I'll hand over to Sam, who will have a chat with Jesmin, and this is very much an open chat.
Sorry, let me just add on to that. I was also a compliance manager in HMRC, so I will manage caseworkers in VAT, corporation tax, pay as you earn, and income tax as well. So before I went on to become the ADR design lead for HMRC, so I would have knowledge of the management process. How to manage the caseworkers and what quality review and so on would be expected to happen. I think it was interesting what Sam said earlier on about fair treatment. You know, each taxpayer should be treated fairly on the same basis. In this respect, I think HMRC has simply been overwhelmed with the volume of work that has come in, and they just don't have the dedicated resources in order to deal with that, and that's why they've gone to this conveyor belt kind of approach on the cases, and it's had a detrimental effect. So you're not getting those requests probably for phone calls and for meetings, because there's not a dedicated case owner is the best way to say it, a case owner who can look over the whole case and review the whole case in its entirety and then say, okay, this is what's happened, blah, 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 and this is why we disagree. And you're not going to have that kind of lead caseworker to come forward. So HMRC actually has to find someone to take ownership of the case before stepping forward to have a meeting, or at least have a technical lead on the case who can represent the case in that respect. So that is actually what's happening behind the scenes, rather than, I think, this deliberate intention not to meet the taxpayer. Is actually a complete lack of resources on their side. Okay.
Which is still not fair, is it, to the taxpayer?
It's still not fair, but then for that we need like proper resourcing of HMRC to be able to tackle it, and processes to be agreed with stakeholders, with like external stakeholders like ourselves, which is sort of what's happening now. But that dialogue should really have taken place probably 2 years ago. Yeah.
And on Ian's last slide, it was quite interesting to see that, you know, some of these inquiries are 2-3 months to sort out, and others, because of the questioning rounds that they go through, 2 years, and we're still not resolved, which is ridiculous, isn't it? So it's interesting with HMRC. So again, they've got to treat every taxpayer the same from their perspective. If they think there's a problem, they need to pursue it. So they're happy to do that. And to me, the taxpayer, I'm thinking, how much is HMRC now invested in chasing down this inquiry versus the return they're going to get? But on the other hand, they say we've got to treat everybody fairly. On the other hand, but you can't talk to us, so we're not going to treat you fairly. It's odd. It's
the outcome that's come as a lack of resourcing, and I think they are trying to put more resources in it. And we've already seen that from the previous slides, but it does lead to, when you've got people who are not trained in the area, not properly trained, because it's been used as a conveyor belt, remember, where it's just coming around, the case is just coming around, and I think you can all see it, copy and paste responses that has been provided by the technical lead, and then you ask the same question, you answer, and then you get the same thing again and again and again, you know, no proper movement on constructive movement on the case until it gets to the technical lead. I mean, I call it false economy, because you're saving costs here in order for it to, like, further down the lane, it's going to expend further cost of resources and time at a later on, perhaps more at the taxpayer's expense than it is HMRC, because they're applying a volume approach. So you may have I'm just making these stats up, like 100 cases, and out of the 100 cases, maybe 1 or 2 will actually go all the way to tribunal, you know, or appeal stage. So for them, they think, okay, we've dealt with the other 98 or 99, and that's how it's been dealt with, not properly dealt with, but for whatever reason it's been closed. And so it makes sense to them to have the one case that they can dedicate more resources for at the other end of the process. It's unfair, it's not right, because actually the other 99 cases, there's a higher proportion of genuine, you know, R&D claims that are being rejected.
Okay. Thank you, Jasmine.
We went straight into the deep end.
Yeah, didn't we just all straight into the deep end? Okay, so I'm gonna just wind it back a little bit now. So everybody, we first had a conversation with Jesmin sort of a couple of months ago, and we sat down. We had a really good session with Jesmin to understand ADR, and it was really interesting how you set the scene, and you talked about your role at HMRC to create the ADR process. So I don't know if you want to just sort of recap that in a couple of minutes.
It was like a pilot scheme, and so there's small sections in like certain areas in UK where we had a pilot scheme running, and it was very small at that point, and we had only originally when I came on board there were 6 ADR mediators in the team. And the stats, the results from that showed it was an overwhelming success. The whole idea was we needed another approach, a more cost-effective approach, where tax disputes had reached an impasse, so it's not moving for whatever reason. Rather than go down the tribunal route, is there a way we could mediate, try and reach a resolution on one day? That's the idea of it. And then I came on board, I think back in 2012. I was actually engaged in order to implement ADR on a national basis across all of the teams in UK and externally. And so what we would call in HMRC business as usual. So implement it in our normal day-to-day operations. And that was my role in bringing ADR into operational practice.
Yeah. So you are very much the competent professional in the room, then, aren't you?
I expanded that team from 6 people to 24 at that time.
And they go through, if you like, an externally accredited course, don't they, to be trained as that mediator?
Yes, they do. But at that time, so we had the more senior people who did have the accredited course. And interestingly enough, that was done in partnership with the big 4, like Deloitte, Grant Thornton, and so on, where they paid for some of, which is like an internal issue, but where they paid for some of the costs, because at that time it was, the training was quite cost. And then we had an in-house training scheme at that time in order to train them up. And that's what I was responsible for, to implement all the training needs for our caseworkers. That was part of my portfolio. Then afterwards, we got the budgeting in order to put all of our people through the accredited mediation program.
And are the mediators still kind of trained up to that same level of professionalism? So if you do go down the ADR process, the mediator should be absolutely top drawer and have that balanced view.
They should have, but now from what we've seen after I left, before there would be more of a challenge in the mediation process. So both sides would be challenged, and like HMRC, they would say, well, are you comfortable with stating that position? Would you be comfortable to go to tribunal on that position? And that was the challenge. As well as on the other side, on the taxpayer side, they will say, well, do you think that's that's a reasonable premise to put across, and so on. So in order to drill down what the actual dispute, and narrow the scope down. But from what I'm seeing now, it's more passive. So they say, okay, we are neutral in this sense. You are both the decision makers, both parties, and so we are here just to mediate, to facilitate but you have to take ownership of your dispute and come to an agreement. So it's a bit more passive than how it was before. And I think that's when you need someone to kind of just step up and challenge the premise, or use a mediator and say, can you like put this across or put this across, and so on.
Okay, so we'll probably come on to that in a little bit. So you mentioned earlier that at the beginning ADR was used across sort of corporation tax and VAT and whatnot.
Any tax disputes,
and in really, it'd be quite interesting to understand a little bit more about what role does it actually play in the process. We've had these rounds in the context of R&D tax. We've had rounds of questions. Would you like to sort of talk us from that position? You've had your third round. You've had a letter to say, we're now going to charge you penalties and you've got to pay it all back.
You can apply for ADR at any time of the process. That was the idea, any time at all. But it doesn't make sense if all the information hasn't been submitted, because what's going to happen is that during the ADR process, you say, oh, we don't agree on this. And then they say, oh, we haven't got this information, so we can't make a decision on that. So it needs to be at a point when all the information and documents have been exchanged. So you go with the complete set of papers, so to speak, when you go in. That's when you should apply for ADR, when there's nothing further or to be provided, or it is really stuck because it's over an issue where HMRC might be demanding something, but you're not willing or cannot give it for whatever reason. So there's got to be like a grey area, which I think we can appreciate. This whole R&D area is now a grey area in order to go to submit an application on and go forward. So there's not like a specific time, but I think the best time would be when all the information documents have been submitted, or it's just simply stuck. Before an appeal, before the decision has been issued, as in an assessment has been issued where the R&D claim has been rejected, I think it's always better to do it before then, because the clock's not ticking, is how I say it. Because after a decision's been issued and the assessment's been issued, then the clock's ticking on the tax liability. So you've got then 30 days to appeal, and then you put an ADR application in, and by that time the tribunal services is involved, because a tribunal appeal has to be submitted at that point in order to safeguard the taxpayer's position, appeal rights to appeal, formal appeal, and also to ensure that it doesn't expire. The right to appeal does not expire from the HMR from the taxpayer's point of view.
So kind of by the second round of questions in an R&D tax investigation, as the taxpayer who's making the claim, you've kind of presented virtually all the information you possibly can, and then's the time. Sounds like that's kind of the time when you think,
I think that
for
would
crying
be
out loud, I've given you so much information.
Yeah, because that way you don't have the clock ticking on it, because afterwards, after the appeal and you put an appeal to tribunal, directions will start coming from the tribunal services, and you have to justify a postponement in the proceedings and say, we want to stay off proceedings because blah 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 and blah. So the clock's ticking on that side, whereas on this side the clock is not ticking. You've got a bit more flexibility to explore the areas with HMRC.
And kind of the real benefit of ADR is around the fact that it doesn't cost money to do. You can spend money on getting expertise on your side to defend what you're doing.
Yes.
And some of that may be covered by your tax insurance through your accountants, or it might be a fee you have to find. But the actual cost it's not like a tribunal where you've suddenly got solicitors and lawyers and everything else, and that which could cost you an awful lot of money. It's meant to be, as you say, a one-day, quite quick, low-cost solution.
It's meant to be. So on HMRC's side, it's when you submit the application that and they provide a mediator, that is all free. So from there, the resources they've put into it, that is actually all free to the taxpayer. And it's something I always say we should use it, because if you don't use something, you might actually lose the services as a result. But it's been shown to be quite effective in this kind of area. So they do have a high resolution rate as a result of getting HMRC to come to the other side of the table and having that constructive engagement. And you've got the mediator there to ensure that it is constructive. It's not. The thing that I like about ADR is we're all on the same page in regards to we want to reach a resolution. Even if you disagree, it's less adversarial than you would have in a normal compliance meeting outside that process, because the compliance meeting you may have with a caseworker, if you can get to that point, it will be with an agenda, and the agenda is HMRC will say, well, we can't see it, where's the R&D? I think I put on a LinkedIn post today as an example is you can have an R&D claims being submitted, and they see huge global benefits to it, because it's actually about UK drainage of water, resolving the flood issues in UK and so on. And when you put that forward, but what all HMRC will see is just a tube. It doesn't make any sense to them. They just see just a tube, maybe a few tubes or whatever, and it doesn't make sense. So we have that issue that if you have a meeting and you still put across the R&D, this is the impact, this is how we're dealing with it, and it's a resolution or solving a long-standing problem in UK. So you come out with all of this, and you may have a competent advisor or professional there who sometimes can't even get a word in because HMRC hasn't allowed them to say anything. No, we want to talk to the director who submitted the R&D claim, and it's not recognised. He won't recognise it, or he or she won't recognise it as R&D. So that you need some kind of neutral, objective party in there in order to bring HMRC to the table on this.
Yeah. And just so with your experience with ADR, so looking at some of the inquiries I've seen, HMRC's stance is there's no R&D in any of the projects you've ever submitted. And through ADR, do you see movement that, okay, so through this process, we can see there actually is some there and there's some here, but on here there isn't. So it becomes not a negotiation, but an acceptance.
I definitely have seen movement on the ADR side, and so we've managed quite successfully for HMRC to acknowledge that yes, this is R&D. But I think the last day at ADR we had, there was a natural research paper submitted in Europe on the R&D. So I mean, you can't get any more R&D than that. But the caseworker then said, well, when the HMRC policy was there, who said he's been working on this case for 2 years, so you can't expect him to come to a decision in the hour on whether this is R&D or not. But the way I see it is, I don't see how HMRC can come to any other decision at the end of the day, especially if you've got the competent professional who actually teaches in university on high-level boards across research boards across Europe, as well as UK, and also submitted a research paper on this very issue, including the project. So he's actually submitted a research paper on the project that was carried out. I don't see there's any way for HMRC to go. And so it wasn't, that's the last ADR I had. So within itself, it may not have been successful, but now what I've done is I've said, within the next 30 days, you have to come to a decision on this, because you've been given everything. You've said in the ADR session, you can't be expected to come into a decision over 1 hour, which I kind of think is more face saving than anything else for the caseworker. But we would expect to see it within 30 days. So it kind of forces movement where HMRC would just simply not move. And so I'm also in communications with the solicitor in HMRC who's representing the tribunal cases in this area, because we're all waiting actually with bated breath in this industry for more tribunal cases to be heard. So I know there's like 2 that's going to be heard later on this year. And I just simply said to the solicitor that, to the lawyer, that if this R&D claim actually goes to tribunal, which I don't think it will, but if it does, then HMRC is simply going to look ridiculous at the end of the day, because how, compared to the caseworkers' technical knowledge and compared to this, we've got this professor, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't reconcile in any way.
Okay, so that's quite an interesting point, isn't it? This, I don't know, I've never been involved with an inquiry with other tax schemes, but for me, because R&D is around guidelines, and guidelines are guidelines, they're not rules, in my view. So the interpretation of those guidelines, how have you found the difficulties of ADR for R&D tax versus other taxes? Or is there still
definitely
that ambiguity across all taxes? I don't know.
No, this is why I got really involved with R&D, especially when the Quinn case came out as well. I just see a much more aggressive approach, to be frank, in this area, which is not reasonable. I don't think, especially being ex-HMRC, I really don't think it's reasonable. And that's why I've got more involved, and also that's how we got in contact, isn't it? Sharing information and ways to defend ourselves as well, and the other agents as well who cannot afford representation. They may not be able to afford that, and other company directors, but then they need to be given that ammunition in order to defend the R&D claim against HMRC when they're being completely unreasonable. So yeah, this is a specific area where it's quite aggressive, and it seems to be incorporated in the compliance process. So I've had this feedback. Caseworkers are not trained. They're not trained in this area, and this is why you've got this poor compliance handling. But I think, well, at the end of the day, you've got technical leads, you've got compliance managers and so on who should be checking what's going on. This has just become the compliance process for HMRC. Yep. So it's not about training, it's about the actual compliance process. This is the way they're expected to deal and respond to cases. So that's what needs to be really looked at. And really, it needs to be replanned, completely refreshed, I think, the whole approach.
We're running out of time. I've just got one last question. Is why? So of the letters we've seen, they never offer ADR. It goes, we're closing this, or you can go take us to tribunal. Boom.
Yes.
Which absolutely terrifies companies, because they think, oh my God, High Court London, it's going to cost a fortune, and it's a £10,000 cash refund that they're after. So you're not going to do it, and so they just browbeat companies. Why don't they say, or why do you think they don't advertise ADR as a better way of going, instead of just shutting it down in the hope that the SME clears off into the sunset?
I think that's the case for HMRC and the ADR team to answer, really, because it should be on all the you know, the when you get the assessment, and then it says you've got the as well. So I mean, it should be part of the process, really, for it to be written there. And if it's not there, if the information is not there, then that is something that you know, the ADR team is supposed to hash out with the R&D team to make sure it's offered. But I tell you what, the ADR team are discussing R&D cases every week. They're getting the applications in, and it's one of the main topics now of their weekly teleconferences within HMRC, because it's such an area, because they don't have, it's a flawed process, to be frank, the R&D compliance process. It's not built in their process to have meetings, so or constructive discussion. And now the pressure is now going to fall on ADR to implement or to cover what should already be a day-to-day operational process, really.
Wow. Jesmin, thank you so much for those insights into the world of ADR. I could have carried this conversation on for another 20 minutes, because I love hearing you talk about and the nuances around the process. But anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to hand you back to Ian.
Yeah.
It sounds like a TV, and here's Sam Stevens signing off from Walsall in Nottinghamshire.
I nearly came in as the BBC sort of saying, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to cut that question off now. But yeah, no, we have run over slightly, but that's pretty much fascinating insight, Jesmin. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. So just going to sort of move on. The last couple of slides, very briefly. You know, this is the team at R&D at TBAT. You know, we are very technical in nature, apart from Elaine and Callum, who are accounts based, but we keep recruiting. We've got another two new starters coming in shortly, one of which is technical, one of which is an accountancy based. So we keep building that team to maintain our strong response to HMRC and support our clients. You know, this is very much our process. You know, it's about fact finding. It's about making sure that the company does the right things, so that they're not over claiming, and it's our job to make sure that those claims put forward are strong and well justified. And these are our services. We don't just cover R&D tax credits. We have a great success on the grant funding side. I personally do the video games tax relief, which is a really interesting area. capital allowances, which is embedded capital allowances, help out with SEIS and EIS support, which is Sam's bag, and patent box, which is also one of Sam's specialist areas. So we can support in a number of different areas. We obviously answered everybody's questions because not a single question was posed. So hopefully that's a sign of a good webinar. And that's our contact details. So please get in contact with either myself or Sam. And if you want to follow up with any questions, and just give them the final opportunity. If anybody's got any questions, please shout up. Otherwise, we will wrap it up there. And thank you, Sam. Thank you, Jesmin. Really insightful as to what the current situation is and hopefully the way to go forward. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. Cheers now.
Bye, everyone.
Right. Cheers.